I'm happy to introduce Christopher Jones. Chris is the Knowledge Exchange Fellow for the Tyndall Centre in Manchester, currently working on a variety of projects that help to transfer research from the Tyndall Group into policy, industry, and community applications. Chris, are you with us?
Yes, thanks. Hello, everyone.
Welcome and take it away.
Brilliant, thank you. We've seen recently that there's been a lot of interest from local actors such as cities and local authorities, municipal authorities, in setting their own climate change agendas, sometimes through platforms such as C40 and Race to Zero, and sometimes just independently. And this reflects, I think, a gap between perceived lack of national leadership and growing pressure from residents, customers, and voters living within those cities and towns for climate action that is proportionate to the climate change challenge. But local authorities don't just want to be told that immediate action is needed and that it should decarbonise as fast as they can. They want targets that are measurable and that they can take action on, and that sort of feed into their policy processes. It also seems to be the case that the question isn't necessarily how fast can we go, but when they engage with some stakeholders and some parts of the organisation, the question might be more, how slow can we get away with? And in that sense, cities need to be able to go to a wider coalition of stakeholders to be successful on emissions with a robust and defensible climate change strategy. And it's into this space that we've stepped to develop these local carbon budgets, the Scatter project that we initially worked on, which was a pilot project funded by the UK government on how local climate change targets could be devised. And we started with a very basic framing, which was to understand what the global ambition is and what it means for the total quantity of CO2 emissions over the coming century. So those cumulative emissions that Kevin was talking about, and that carbon budget that he showed on the slide in his keynote. So working from the IPCC's latest global CO2 carbon budgets and the temperature and significantly the equity goals of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And my colleagues Kevin, Jace Kyriakos, John Broderick, Isaac, who we introduced today, and Carly McLaughlin developed an approach to allocate a share of a Paris climate change aligned global carbon budget to local areas, and to account for a clear account of how that equity principle has been applied. Another key decision made in developing that approach was to produce a carbon budget for energy CO2 only on a territorial basis. This is firstly to acknowledge that the non-CO2 gases and land use CO2 emissions and emissions from outside the area are significant. And we have recommendations that frame and constrain that local carbon budget, but they're not quantified at the local level. And this comes back to that point I made earlier about measurable and actionable targets as part of the local authority process. Because local data on CO2 from local energy use is relatively straightforward to get to baseline and accurately measure progress, which again, are key features of effective local climate policy. Whereas consumption emissions from goods flowing in and out of the city and for non-CO2 gases are much more challenging to monitor. And as yet, we don't have that at a local scale, certainly not in the UK, and I think that's the case for many other areas. And secondly, we have an IPCC global CO2 budget. We don't have that for other types of gases. And finally, cities have more direct control over their local energy use emissions than they do from other sources of emissions. And again, that gives a practical and methodological reason for how we frame this approach for measurable and actionable targets. Because ultimately these targets have to go into strategy and then into action. And they have to bring on board private and public sector and community stakeholders as well. Because the cities themselves have fairly limited power to influence, but they can leverage their existing influence and convening power to do even more. So the budgets give short-term interim targets, 5-yearly targets that they're quite clearly evidenced and it can be shared across a wide range of stakeholders. But importantly, they also embody the principle of path dependency in climate change targets. The idea that if we don't take enough action now in the next few years, we have to take even greater action in subsequent years in order to keep below a particular emissions threshold and to deliver on our targets. And we found that carbon budgets are a really good way to engage cities on this and to internalize these principles, that it's not just about the scale of change in the long run, but the urgency for near-term action that is significant. And we've done this with another number of UK cities already, and we've seen how that principle can be translated into strategy documents for infrastructure planning, for housing development, and for energy action planning within the city, and also bringing on community groups and businesses into the process. And we're now working with CDP and ClimSec, who are also involved in this call. So Anders at the start, to develop this approach for other countries. We've done it for the UK, and the guys have done it in Sweden. But we're also developing this tool for use in Norway, the Netherlands, and Germany to go with those versions. And I'd be happy to talk to people after this about any questions to do with that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris. So next, I'd like to present our two speakers that we have joining us. Firstly, we have Sanna Gunnarsson, and Sanna is a master's student at KTH within the field of sustainable urban planning and design. And she's joined by Derek Garfield, who is a master's student of sustainable development at Uppsala University. So they're going to be presenting together on how municipal and regional carbon budgets can be used as a tool for local climate transitions. Welcome, Sanna and Derek.
Thank you, Izzy, so much for having us. We can take the next slide directly, I think. Thank you. So this presentation is based on two different master theses carried out now during the spring, where Derek and myself have focused on the implementation of local carbon budgets in Swedish municipalities and regions. And we're very happy to briefly be sharing some of our findings with you here today, even if the work is still to be finalized and published now in the weeks or months ahead. So starting out with some main takeaways from my study, we can take the next slide, please. I've been interested in how local carbon budgets are interpreted in the local context of Swedish municipalities. And in short, I've explored if and how local carbon budgets can be a tool for municipalities in facilitating sustainability transitions, and how that relates to different narratives of change. And what I found through my analysis was that yes, Lcbs, local carbon budgets, can in fact be perceived as several different tools for sustainability transitions, suggesting different types of change. So here you see 4 different suggestions for tools that the local carbon budget can be. First, the Lcb can be seen as a carbon accounting tool, which helps the municipality to monitor its emissions and improve municipal climate mitigation strategies. Second, the Lcb can be perceived as a tool supporting necessary collaboration between local actors. Or the Lcb can be considered to be a tool for stronger regulatory approaches and that the municipality gets tougher in its climate mitigation. Or finally, one perception is rather that the Lcb has a more radical potential in that it calls for a critical discussion around what norms and structures that shapes current climate mitigation. And what is interesting with this is that the Lcb can be many different things when arriving and getting implemented in the municipal context. And the key point, I think, is that these different views on what the Lcb contributes with creates different possibilities for what kind of change or transition pathways that are supported. And as you can see in my study, I've connected this to different narratives of change, spanning from a more incremental view, which I here call tweak the system, to a more radical approach, which is here called shake the system. And there is, of course, much more to say about this, but I leave it with that and hand over to Derek, who will tell you more about how Lcbs can relate to local governance. And we can take the next slide there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sanna. And I'd like to say that I think Sanna's research provides a very nice context for my own. and that many of the things that she finds present in her study, I also found present during my interactions in Västra Götaland. Like Sanna, my research revealed that many actors draw parallels between these local carbon budgets and internal economic budgets. But it also revealed how such an approach might not holistically address all carbon emissions across the territory. And I can illustrate how using an LCB is different than an economic budget by asking the following question. Could you plan and administer an economic budget that includes the budgets of every person and organization within your municipality or region without having the power to determine how those budgets would be spent? And I believe that's the challenge that you're facing if you try to use LCBs as one would an economic budget. So how might we address this challenge to address emissions more holistically? Based on my analysis, I suggest that we think about LCBs not just as a supplement to accounting practices within a municipality or region or company, but as a platform for a natural resource management approach. An LCB represents the atmosphere, not as a distant global commons, but as a local common pool resource area that corresponds to a local jurisdiction. It creates an emissions resource space and defines an available amount of measurable resource units as tons of carbon emissions that everyone within the area can access and consume. Consequently, I suggest that policymakers could use common pool natural resource management approaches, for example, Elinor Ostrom's well-known design principles for sustainable common pool resource institutions, in tandem with their LCBs as an additional strategy to address the mitigation of territorial emissions. Next slide. In summary, both of our studies highlight the different ways that LCBs frame the governance challenge posed by climate change. And we look forward to discussing this with you during our breakout sessions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, both. Next up, I would like to welcome JOHAN GÄRDEBO. JOHAN is a historian of science, technology, and environment, currently a postdoctoral fellow at Linköping University, studying how Swedish industrial towns transition to a decarbonized society. JOHAN will be speaking today about the concept of Swedish just transition and how that relates to union workers. Welcome, JOHAN.
Thank you, Isabel. And following on the presentations by Chris, Derek, and Sanna, I want to draw your attention to just transition, a term that has rapidly come to dominate debates on the process of decarbonizing our economy. And I look at how Swedish unions view just transition, in brief, how the transition is perceived as being done with, for, or against union workers. Next slide, please. So if we start with the transition as a term, the emphasis has been on how to decarbonize industry, that is, create new jobs, green jobs. And this has been formulated globally in the Paris Agreement at COP21 and also nationally when the Swedish government launched Fossil-Free Sweden in the run-up to COP21 during winter 2015. Then in 2017, Sweden's climate policy framework clarified that the transition had to be just in the sense of establishing a fossil-free welfare state by 2045. But it's still unclear how a just transition is to be organized. It is worth emphasizing that international labor unions have for decades promoted the term just transition, and part of the reason why the term was adopted in the Paris Agreement is because of alliance building between unions and environmental organizations at the international level. And this alliance has been described in Morena et al.'s book from 2020 as an attempt by unions and environmentalists to overcome a jobs versus climate divide. Next slide, please. In recent years, however, there have been several populist backlashes against numerous climate policies throughout the Western world. And among the most notorious are the Yellow Vest Rebellion in France, where workers protested against taxes on gasoline. And here in Sweden, a similar movement, the Fuel Rebellion, gathered over 150,000 members against how Swedish climate policies affect people with carbon-intensive jobs. These carbon-centered protest movements raises the question of whether or not it is possible to overcome the jobs versus climate divide. Next slide. So to answer that question, I've talked to people who have these jobs, ask them what they think would be a just transition. And I've done so at 3 places: SSAB steelmaking in Luleå, Primrefs oil refining in Lysekil, and Cementa's chalk mining and cement production in Slite. Together, these three sites make up 1/3 of Sweden's annual industrial emissions, which is significant since industry constitutes 1/3 of Sweden's total carbon emissions. Any effective decarbonization policy will then also dramatically impact these places and hence the people living there. I've interviewed representatives, next slide please, from all labor unions at SSAB in Luleå, Primraf in Lysekil and Cementa in Slite. And these are industries with nearly total union membership among the workforce. And after I learned that local unions had very similar views on what constitutes a just transition, I also wanted to talk with union reps at the central and international level, most of which have offices in Stockholm, so as to contrast between center and periphery. Next slide, please. So from the results so far, I want to draw your attention to differences in how unions at local and central level viewed just transition that I believe are meaningful. Local unions viewed transition primarily from the lens of inhabitants of a region, with loyalty both to the industry itself, but also to families working there. The job of the union is to maintain status quo, and this means supporting company leadership, sometimes defending it publicly, for example against environmental organizations in media debates. In effect, this extends the time plan for when the transition is to be completed. By contrast, the central unions are primarily concerned with developing new jobs and an environmental profile. This is primarily because other unions or lobbying organizations are busy developing their profiles. What drives plans for transitions is not an internal dialogue with local union reps, but discourse among other central organizations. So to summarize, while the central unions view just transition as an issue of coordinating conflicting interests, the local unions view just transition as a scramble for resources with the aim of securing survival for their industry and their region. Next slide, please. So, to tie back to the initial question of what is a just transition, we can take next slide, I believe. Firstly, more analysis need to be put on how the Progressive Alliance is established, not only at the central level, but also at the local level. In brief, there is still a jobs versus climate divide. Secondly, more work need to be put on what role unions have with regards to transition technologies. Initiatives like hybrid are still company-led, where unions only play a supportive role, but in no way have power over these new means of production. Thirdly, a just transition appears to be a local transition, but one that is influenced externally, both by national climate policies and international business models. For example, the risk of offshoring carbon-intensive production, causing job loss and exporting a Swedish carbon debt. And finally, as the term just transition gains in political currency, it will most likely break down into specific claims about what is just. For example, the right to reskilling, redistribution, recognition, or restoration of nature. And over time, if I'm to guess, the debate will eventually shift from discussing who has rights towards who is able and willing to take on responsibilities for this transition.
Thank you, Johan. Final rapid talk. I would like to welcome Mikhail Carlson. Mikhail is Associate Professor in Environmental Science and a Senior Lecturer in Climate Change Leadership, my colleague at Uppsala University. His research focuses on environmental governance, and in particular, on science and policy interactions. To speak with us today about barriers and drivers when using carbon budgets for societal transformations, welcome, Mikhail.
Thank you, Isi, and nice to be here in this conference. I would like to start with saying, well, that despite the pandemic occupying much of present debate and day-to-day thinking and acting, as well as political decision-making, climate change is indeed the topic that increasingly dominate and define present times. That wasn't the case just a decade ago. And even though the pandemic fits well with the now soon 35-year-old theory of the risk society hypothesis has largely been scoped and focused on climate change. And I was thinking that after the Paris Agreement in 2015, what could possibly divert attention elsewhere in society? And if someone then would have suggested that a kind of grown-up, childish person would become president in the most influential power on earth and outright deny climate change, I might have been concerned that other main regions in the world will step down from commitment and engagement. But despite that happening, despite Trump, climate change has continued to climb on the global agenda. And the setbacks we saw with Trump might now be turned into their complete opposite. This climate crisis that we all confront gives rise to a number of questions. We can explore what, and we can explore how, what we need to do and accomplish, and how we can achieve that. But I would say that the answers to those questions are fairly well known, well researched, even though the ambitions, fortunately, have been raised over the years, over the decades. Having followed these issues for nearly 30 years in most sectors, civil society, research, etc., I see the identification of zero, including net zero, as a potentially important step compared to previous emission targets expressed in terms of reduction in percentage. I don't actually see anything proving that net zero would be a more troublesome or larger excuse than, let's say, a standalone emission target on 85% emission reduction up to 2045. On the contrary, net zero used in the right way could give leverage to improve policies. And if you take the Swedish case with a net zero target for 2045, combined with figures for percentage emission reduction for 2045, 2040, and even 2030, which all in all constitute a carbon budget, we have all of those. I'm the first to acknowledge that all these targets, as well as the interpretation of net zero, are far too weak, but that is not something that is new. Nevertheless, besides what we need to do, which is fairly well known, and what we need to do in order to reach the targets in terms of reducing emissions by decreasing consumption, improving energy savings, improving efficiency, developing renewables, changing everything from diets to industrial technologies, which we also know fairly well, I'm more interested in the question of why, in the sense of why are we not doing this? Why are we not transforming societies? Because we know a lot about the problems. We know a lot about solutions for how to cope with the problems. And we also know a lot about why we're not using the solutions at hand, from technologies to behavioral change to adapting policies, changing systems, etc. But we're still not doing it. This is a question that's relevant for a number of environmental problems, in particular those having this wicked problem character. But we know that we can cope with such issues as well. For instance, the pandemic. So why are we not closing the gaps faster and better? Well, I don't know. That's why I'm doing research. I have focused in my research in particular on the barriers and drivers for transformation in both the science sphere and the policy sphere. In relation to science, we see that science denial is a huge problem in many cases, not least concerning climate science and climate science policy. In the policy sphere, we see clearly that requirements for decision-making are often very difficult to meet. We see that decision-making criteria are often biased and tilted in a way that impede action. And we see that the burden of proof to do more rapidly, often rests on those wanting to increase emissions, those who call for stricter policies. It does not rest on the people of yesterday, those orienting themselves into the future by looking in the rear mirror, those defending business as usual. They're not confronted with the burden of proof for that being a better option. So if you're interested to discuss further why we see so little action when we know so much, then please join this breakout room on barriers and drivers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mikhail. So now